Looks like I forgot to change that class 2 to class number 3 here. We're in actual class number 3, history 2, which is probably why I missed it. So in our schedule here, we're in the 3rd class, and the final class that we will be in before we actually get into the material for this class. We will start the book of Joshua on Wednesday evening. We will start that. So just a very quick review of where we left off on Wednesday. We talked about Abraham, how he was a friend of God, called by God to leave his home and to travel to a place I will show you. And then we looked on a map where that is and some of the different things. So he was in Ur, which is down there at the delta between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers down there. And then up through Haran, which actually takes its name from his brother and his brother's family that live in that, his brother, yeah, that's right, and his brother's family that live in that area, down through Shechem, which is also called Bethel. On the return call, he spends some time in Egypt, comes back all the way up through the land to Damascus, and then ends up settling there primarily down around Jerusalem, is where he spends the rest of his life there. We talked very quickly about how that he's important not only to Bible history, but to world history. Abraham is a very important person because of the 3 still major religions that would exist today. He is the beginner of all of them. They all trace their roots to that. Judaism, of course, the Jews would trace their lineage to Father Abraham. Christianity, even Paul tells us we are inheritors of the promise to Abraham. And of course, Islam also traces its root back to Abraham, but instead of going through Isaac, through Ishmael is where they would trace their roots there. We talked about how that this passage in Genesis chapter 12, that promise to Abraham really begins this pre-Christ period, ends up that whole, okay, we've got sin in the world, look how bad things are. We had to have the flood and those kind of things just to deal with man's sin. Where in the world is this going to go? There seems to be no hope. But of course, now this promise to Abraham, we see the first hope in the story because of this promise that he is going to, or that all nations will be blessed through his seed there. So just quickly to talk about the 5 elements of the promise: the land, what could be seen from Bethel, basically from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt. And I didn't mention this on Wednesday, and I got asked about it afterwards. That river of Egypt, typically if I said a river in Egypt, what would you think of? The Nile. That's not what that is, okay? There is actually a little wadi, which is a river that's sometimes there, sometimes not, right in that border between Palestine and Egypt that's called the River of Egypt, okay? That's what that refers to there. Of course, a promise that he would be a great nation, descendants like the stars in the sky and sand on the shore, and that many different nations would come through him. A great name, kings would come through him, which of course we know is going to also flow through Judah. The blessings and the curses, God would be his shield. And then of course the one that's most important to us, an everlasting promise to his descendants that all families would be blessed. So we then talked about this purple thread that flows through Abraham down to Isaac and through Jacob, and then down on into through Judah, through the rest of the Israelites there. The family, we left off with the family going to Egypt. Who was the first in the family to go to Egypt was Joseph, and because he was sold by his brothers, actually, and he went down there as a slave. And the rest of the family goes to Egypt because of famine. We said if anybody asks you, why did someone in the Bible go to Egypt, there's only 2 reasons. The most prominent reason is famine. 5 times out of 6, it's going to be they went for famine. The one other time is going to be, well, I had to run away from somebody. And so they go down there. Primarily David and Jesus are the ones who had to flee to Egypt for protection there. Okay? So they go to Egypt, and as we left off on Wednesday, we find the entire family of Abraham, which is now, the family of Jacob, whose name has been changed to Israel. We find them moved into Egypt, and then they land in this place which is called Goshen, part of the richest part of Egypt. And why were they given such choice land? Because of Joseph. Yeah, because of Joseph. That's right. Because Joseph was such a great man. He had saved Egypt from this terrible famine because he was able to foretell Pharaoh's dreams, and then also not just foretell those dreams, but then implement a plan and be the guy who made it happen so that everybody didn't starve to death. It's kind of funny when you think about Joseph was sold to Egypt by his brothers because they wanted to get rid of him. But they ended up having to go there because he was such a good manager that there was food left in this terrible famine. Okay, so that's why they had to go there to get food, because they heard there was food aplenty in Egypt. And that was 100% because of Joseph there. So now we've got the family in Egypt, and they're going to be there for quite a while. Anybody have any idea how long they are in Egypt, roughly? Well, it's roughly 400 years, right? Okay, so there's going to be roughly 40 years or so. I couldn't hear what everybody was saying, I'm sorry. Roughly 40 to who knows how many years exactly that Joseph was there before things go away. And then there's a period of time, we don't know how long a period of time, but enough period of time that the Israelites can multiply and start to grow. And then there's going to be a period of time when they were in slavery. And they were enslaved roughly 350 years or so that they were in slavery. So total time in Egypt is 400 years plus. And why were they enslaved? We mentioned this very briefly a couple classes ago with this idea of looking at the actual leaders of Egypt here. But in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, we see this very small and innocuous little verse, but yet it has terrible implications for the people of Israel. Now there arose a new king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. So now all of a sudden, we have this group of non-Egyptians who are living in Egypt, and they get to be a pretty good number, okay? But yet all of a sudden, we have this new complete regime that takes over. This is not typical, Pharaoh dies and his son takes over. This is a revolt. The entire leadership is changed. Massacre happens of the Egyptian royalty, and a whole new family now takes over. And they don't remember Joseph. They don't think about all the things that Joseph had done for the nation of Egypt. And so now all of a sudden, they see these people in their land who are not Egyptians, and what are they? They're scared. They're afraid of them, that's right, okay? So it says the Egyptians were afraid of them because the Bible says they were more and mightier. I'm not sure that there were really more total Egyptians than there were, total Israelites than there were Egyptians, but definitely in that region, right, where they have settled, they have taken over this land. And so there are way more of them, and because of the work that they have been doing, they are stronger, okay? So now, of course, the answer comes in, okay, we've got this great population of people that we're afraid of. Maybe we ought to treat them right. Wouldn't you think? Yeah, no, they go the other way. So, of course, the answer is going to be, no, we're going to make them slaves, and we're going to put them under bondage. We're going to make them build our great cities here. And of course, as typically would happen, if they would have just let them alone or treated them nice, things probably would have went much differently. But as a result of their actions, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. Had complete opposite effect. We're going to make them work hard. Well, if you take people that you already think are stronger than you, and now you make them work really hard, what are you going to do to them? You're going to make them stronger, okay? So apparently they did not understand the idea that if we really want to make these people weak, we need to give them a bunch of stuff and make them not work. Okay. So now, of course, Moses is going to come to the scene. We have God's people have been enslaved for 300 plus years, and now someone is going to be born who's going to take care of that. I guess maybe 260, 250 some odd years before Moses is born. So now Moses is going to be uniquely qualified for the job to be a chosen leader of his people who are still within Egypt, because he was a Hebrew. And of course, we know the very popular kid story of, Pharaoh, it wasn't working out, that making them slaves was making them weak, so he decides we got to start killing them. And so now they're going to kill all of the children as they are born, all the male children. And Moses is spared from that, of course, by his mother and put in the basket, and he ends up then in Pharaoh's household. So it's important then that we understand that it was his choice. At some point along the way, his choice, or maybe his adopted mother, the daughter of Pharaoh there, that he would know the language of his people. Because typically somebody who was raised as an Egyptian, what language would they have spoken? Only Egyptian, right? I mean, there would have been no reason for him to learn the language of the slaves, but yet he does do that, okay? Probably, we don't know this for sure, but probably that was an unpopular choice with his adopted family. At least that's expressed that in many ways in many of the films that tell this kind of story here. So not only was he a Hebrew, but among all of the Hebrews, he was uniquely qualified because of his education. So he was educated and raised as an Egyptian prince. So not only, yes, he knew Hebrew, but he knew Egyptian language. And more importantly, he was raised in the palace of a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And so he knew those Egyptian politics and how they could be manipulated, how they could be worked, and how things could work there. So he is uniquely chosen. There's a great story, which we just don't have time to cover, about him leaving and going out into the wilderness and having his own life out there in Midian with his wife, and then the story of the burning bush, which is just, the more I study it, it becomes more pivotal to my understanding of the Old Testament compared to the New Testament. But we're not going to cover that today. I could talk about that for 3 classes alone, but we just don't have time. So now Pharaoh is to the point where the persecution has kind of reached its height. Moses has left. He's had his 40 years living out in Midian. He's got children. He's got a wife, and he's all happy. But at the burning bush, God calls him and says, it's time for you to go and save my people. And he says, you're going to go to Egypt and you are going to work my wonders. So we're just going to quickly talk about this idea of the 10 plagues and what were the 10 plagues meant to do. Really, they were meant to show Egypt Jehovah's power, because Pharaoh makes a critical mistake here. When Abraham first goes to when Moses first goes to Pharaoh, Pharaoh says, wait a minute, who is the Lord? Here in Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2, Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. This is a bad way to talk to God. Okay? Throughout the Bible, if people ask who is the Lord and they need some kind of proof about who God is, more often than not, it's not going to be the kind of proof you want. It's going to be the kind of proof you don't want. And so that is exactly what God is going to do here. He is going to teach Israel and Pharaoh and all of Egypt a lesson, and he's going to teach Israel a lesson. Because at this time, what does Israel know about Jehovah? Nothing. In fact, Moses, whenever he's talking to God in the bush, says, well, who am I going to tell them sent me? They don't even know who their God is. Okay, and so Moses has to explain all of that to them. But of course then, Pharaoh does ask that question, and so God will answer. Exodus chapter 6 and verse 1, "But the Lord said to Moses, 'Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land.'" God is going to use a strong hand against Pharaoh, and because of that strong hand, he is going to do what God wants him to do. It gets worse. Exodus chapter 7 and verse 5. Sorry, I'm one click behind here. "The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them." And then continuing that down into Exodus chapter 9 and verse 14. "For this time I will send all my plagues on you yourself and on your servants and on your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in all of the earth." Terrible proclamation of God to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians. Okay, you didn't learn and you didn't listen, so now there's going to be no time to work some pretty terrible plagues down upon you. Then proceeds the next 10 plagues, which actually we tend to kind of think of them happening over a very quick period. Scholars will sometimes argue about how long these plagues might have taken, but probably at least a year, if not maybe even slightly more, that all of these plagues took to happen. Just the ramifications of some of the plagues would have taken years and years to get over, but yet they do happen, pile right on top of each other here until Pharaoh is convinced. And what is interesting about the 10 plagues, if you look at them, yes?
How do you know it took a year? We thought it was 10 days.
All right, hold on. All right, say it again.
How do you know that it took a year?
Well, we don't know for sure how long it took. It's just some scholars have estimated that based on timing of floods that would occur annually and different events that would happen. Things like the plague of the locusts and the plague of the flies probably happened in a certain season. I mean, locusts are only going to come and be really dangerous at close to harvest time, right? But some of the flooding and stuff would have happened pre-harvest probably, is when it would have been most effective. So that's where people think that it happened over a longer period of time than a shorter.
God created storms when there shouldn't be.
Oh, of course. And Bobby's point was God could create a storm when there shouldn't be a storm, and definitely there seems to be some aspect to these plagues that have their impact because of their unexpected nature. It's things that shouldn't be happening right now but do. However, I do think that, so like take the locusts for example. Could God have made a plague of locusts when there was no food for the locusts to eat? Of course he could have. But when would that plague have been most effective? Whenever there was food in the fields and whenever it was time to come. And in fact it even talks about how they consume everything that's out there, right? So there had to be crops out there for them to consume. Okay? But realistically, what many people don't think about, and if you've been in classes I've taught before, this is not going to be new to you, and we're going to go through this pretty quickly. But the big thing that the plagues were meant to do was to show, remember what in that last passage, let's see, it's still up there. God is going to show the Egyptians and the Israelites. Yes, it's for the Egyptians, but the real lesson here is for the Israelites. But still, God is going to show that there is none like me in all the earth. What he's saying is that there are no other gods like me in all of the earth. All of the Israelite people for generations have grown up believing probably and thinking, at least learning about the Egyptian gods, which there were a bunch of them, and how they ruled everything from the sun to the crops to the Nile to life and death itself. But God is going to come in and say, those gods of Egypt that you have leaned upon, they are nothing compared to me. And so realistically, that's what each of the 10 plagues do. Sometimes you may think of, why did God choose those 10 things to do to the people? I mean, surely he could have just jumped right to the 10th plague and The people would have left. Wouldn't that have been better? But he systematically destroys all of the Egyptian pantheology of deities here. Okay? So for example, and we're just going to throw some of this up here quickly. In the first one, the Nile turns to blood. Obviously, the Nile being a prime thing in Egypt here, they had several different gods that were in charge of the Nile. Specifically, this Hapi, or Hapi, depending on his name kind of changed over the years. He was really the one who was in charge of the Nile. He was considered to live in the Nile. And he was the one that supposedly made it flood and then go down. As you know, when we looked at that picture of that delta, right? That flooding and receding of waters is what, really allows all of that fertilization of those lands in order for, it to be very fertile, to grow crops there, okay? So he now is no longer going to be in control of the Nile, and instead of it being beneficial to them, and it's going to now be against them. Same thing with another god, Nymph here, is the guy who's supposedly the source of the Nile, depicted as a cow here in this hieroglyph, and he was the one who's considered the guardian of the Nile, protected its source, protected its purity, and of course, by God changing the river to blood just completely overrides him. Anytime you're going to be around water, frogs are going to be pretty prevalent. So when God causes them to take over, there's actually two Egyptian gods that are represented as frog gods or over the frogs here. One is Hek, female goddess. The bringing forth of frogs is meant to mean fruitfulness. Okay, it's meant to, hey, the times of the frog, it's spring, we hear the that means that that was a terrible frog noise, by the way. But we're going to now know that the crops are going to be planted and it's going to be springtime and things are going to be good. Okay. However, the frogs turn into absolutely terrible plague for them here. And another one then for the lice is Geb. He is supposedly an earth god who causes the earth to bring forth blessings, but of course we know it says that the earth brings forth these lice, gnats or fleas, depending upon the translation that you read there. The fourth, the flies. There is actually a lot of fly stuff in Egyptian religions and a lot of their history there. So Nemphi is the god of creation, supposedly. He is the god who caused the sun to move across the sky. He is most typically known as more of a beetle, but of a flying insect there. Typically you'll see a lot of scarab. That idea of a scarab in Egyptian mythology most often would be represented by him. The plague against the livestock, directly against Hathor, who was one of a pair of cow-type goddesses who were supposedly mated. So Hathor was the female version of that. She represented fertility, supposedly the mother of Pharaoh here. Remember, Pharaoh was supposed to be, a god himself. And then, of course, her counterpart, the bull god, which is most likely what the golden calf was modeled after, is this idea, because Egyptians built very similar things to this god Apis, that was the male counterpart of Hathor there, her husband and lover, and the fertility, male side of fertility there. The boils was supposed to be against Thoth, who was the knowledge of writing and medicine. He was seen as a healer. The Bible goes out of its way to point out that all of Egyptians' healers couldn't fix the boils. They couldn't heal them of that because they would have been trying to invoke their god to do that. The fiery hail goes against Nut, who is the sky goddess, sometimes most interestingly portrayed in that picture on the left there as being the overarching goddess of the sky, protecting Egypt, keeping things the way they're supposed to. But of course, the fiery hail comes right through that. And then as we get into these plagues, we get into some more famous gods also. Most of you have probably heard through movies or seen the name Horus, who's one of the major gods in the pantheon of Egyptian mythology here. So he was a sky god, he was a protector, he was the one who most often is seen as the warrior who protects over Egypt, and it's his job to fly as a falcon through the skies and to protect the people of Egypt. We get into the locusts, Anubis, who is supposed to be the protector of the field. He's also the god of death here, one of the more famous gods of Egypt, of course. I'm sure you've all heard that name, Anubis, before. And then also, Isis was supposed to be the protector of the fields. She was also supposed to be the source of magic, supposedly the source of what the Pharaoh's Egyptians could do when the first couple plagues, when they duplicated, at least apparently they duplicated the miracles that Moses was able to do there. And then of course we get to number 9, the darkness. You've all heard before of Ra. I don't know that you could have seen any U.S.-made movie that involved Egypt and not heard the name Ra, the sun god, the strongest, the most important of all of the Egyptian gods. As you can imagine, if you're living in Egypt, what's the strongest force that impacts your daily life every single day? That terrible blazing sun beating down on you. So that is viewed as the strongest god here. And of course, God completely cuts him off. Jehovah just says, you think this is the guy who's in charge of everything? I can take him away completely here. And then, despite all of those plagues not being enough, we know that it comes down and Pharaoh still says, no, the people cannot go. And so Moses says to him, well, there's going to be a final plague. It's going to be worse than all the ones before. And this is going to be the one that is going to change your mind. And of course, we know that is the whole death of the firstborn and the story of the Passover here. And that goes directly against Osiris, of course, who is the god of the dead. He's the giver of life. The idea very prominent in Egyptian mythology is this idea of resurrection, living your life again. And so, of course, God being able to, Jehovah being able to come in here and just wipe out that many people really just shows his dominance over him. And of course, the people themselves views Pharaoh as a type of God, right? He was supposed to be a direct descendant of Ra and the other one, I forget her name. And so he was considered to be divine. He was untouchable, all those kind of things. And his son then, as the next Pharaoh, was also given that status as a kind of a godling, I guess you would call it, a god who's being grown up and going to be raised. And so for the firstborn son, the heir apparent of Pharaoh, Jehovah actually showed the people of Egypt, not only can I block and completely overpower all of your gods, I can kill one of them. So God completely shows his dominance through this story of the Exodus and the story of the Passover, and all of these plagues that go through here. I think the first time that I ever studied this, I was pretty amazed to see just how deeply these plagues line up with Egyptian mythology. I think God was very determined here to show that there was none like him in all of the earth. Okay? And of course, we could have some interesting side discussions about were they real gods, were they spirits who had any kind of power. Several times in the Bible it does talk about God having Jehovah having more power than other gods, so we could talk about that. Yes, sir. And speak loudly, please.
That's right. There's a Bible verse that reinforces what you just said, that Moses is recounting to his father-in-law Jethro, this great deliverance and all the things he did. Jethro replies in Exodus 18 and verse 11, now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them.
That's right. That's right. Even those outside of Egypt learn that, right? Yeah. In fact, whenever they go into the land, 40 years later, what do the people of Canaan, and I'm kind of getting ahead of ourselves because we're going to talk about that in Joshua, but what do the people of Canaan still remember? What the God of Jehovah did to the Egyptians. Okay? That's right. So, of course, the Passover story is the culmination of these plagues, is critical, and we don't have time to go through all these, so I'm just going to whip them up there quickly. I can happily provide this list to you and more if you're interested. Some people have made the conjecture that there's nearly 100 similarities between the Passover and the crucifixion. I typically land around 25 or so that I can pretty concretely say, look, this is a direct comparison between what happened at the Passover and what happened with the crucifixion of Christ. Again, we talked about this in the very first class, but the more you dig into the details of the Old Testament, what do you see about the New Testament? All the fulfillment, that's right. All of it was foretold, all of it was foreshadowed. We were given these incredible examples, and then to find that, sometimes thousands of years later, events unfolded in the exact pattern that we see happen in the Old Testament, you can't help but understand that God was directing things and things were going the way He wanted. So immediately following the Passover, we now are going to see them needing to leave Egypt. So they're going to get ready to cross the sea, but they don't yet trust God. Despite all of these terrible plagues and Pharaoh finally letting them go, they don't really trust in God yet. And as they are fleeing, they come up across to the banks of the Red Sea, and the Red Sea is in front of them, and the Egyptians are behind them, and what do they think? That's it. We're done for, right? And they start complaining and whining. And of course, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? You just took us out of there so they could come kill us out here. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die out here in the wilderness. They completely have lost faith, or maybe I shouldn't say lost faith. They had never had that faith yet, right? They are still even learning who Jehovah is here. So what's interesting to me then is Moses is one of those kind of guys that I think we see a lot of time in leaders. His response is great to them. Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to be silent. Hey, just quit complaining and watch what God is going to do here. But maybe he was a bit hypocritical, because when he goes and talks to God, what is his tone? He starts crying to God just like the people cried to him, right? And so God's response is, why do you come crying to me? You told the people I was going to protect them. Go do it. And so, of course, then we know he tells them to go forward, and Moses very famously raises his staff over the waters, and it parts, and they cross over on dry ground. And then, of course, the Egyptians come running in after them, and then the salvation from the Egyptian army is made complete. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, all of the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. So if it wasn't enough that they had all of those miracles that went against the Egyptians and they were sheltered from, they were able to see that as part of God's power, they still don't believe it. They get out in the wilderness, and now they have their first hand, just absolute, clear as day. God is the one who fought for them. God is the one who saved them from the Egyptian army. They didn't even have to raise a hand in their own self-defense. God was able to do that.
Side note, they didn't leave as people that were forced out. They left as conquerors. The Egyptians gave them booty.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, we didn't talk about that, but that is true that they didn't leave empty-handed. They didn't leave like slaves. They left with the bounty of Egypt with them. God influenced the Egyptians to give them all kinds of stuff as they left there. So God's purpose is accomplished. After all, what had been the goal of the plagues and all of this? Who had it really been for? Well, it really was for Israel, right? It was for God's own people. And in fact, we're told here, Israel saw the great power that the Lord had used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord. For the first time, we see this feared the Lord in the Bible, and it is used of God's people now understanding the power that he has. And so the people believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So finally, it seems like after this incredible miracle of crossing the Red Sea, they've got all the stuff they brought with them, the Egyptian army is wiped out, and they are free. And they are super strong in their faith, and they are ready to go. How long does that last? 3 days. 3 whole days it lasts, okay? So where did all these events happen? We said we'd talk a little bit about geography. So we know that they were living primarily in Ramses there. Which way did they go out? Well, there is this highway in blue dots there that is called the Way of the Sea, major highway. Probably would have been the route that they should have taken. We know they didn't go that way. Instead, we know that they go down to a place called Succoth here. And then between Succoth and the wilderness, they're going to cross the Red Sea. Where? We don't know. Okay? There are, scholars will try to present 3 potential routes here that they could have gone through, a northern, a southern, and kind of a middle route. Of course, the geography was slightly different back then. We couldn't pinpoint, even if God had given us markers, we probably couldn't pinpoint exactly where it happened. But they come across, and then they end up 3 days later at this place called Marah, which of course means bitter. And so they run into their first real challenge there at Marah. And I'm one of the people who, I just did it a minute ago, kind of makes fun of them for, after all these miracles and this great statement of faith, yes, now we fear the Lord because we saw what he did to the Egyptians who crossed him. We believe in the Lord because he did what he told us and he saved us. But 3 days later, they're whining. And they're again saying, why did you bring us out here? We should have stayed in Egypt. And we're real quick to judge that. However, I don't know that any of us have walked 3 days through the desert with no water. I might be starting to complain a little bit then too, okay? So that's really what we see here is it takes them 3 days to get to Marah, and as we know, they have no water, and then when they get there, they find water, but it's bitter. They can't drink it, okay? And so, of course, God performs a miracle and gives them that. They're going to go from Marah to the wilderness of Sin is where they're going to spend some time here. And oh man, we're running out of time quickly here. And they are going to go down through Rephidim to Mount Sinai. So where is Mount Sinai in this whole thing? If we look at the path of the Exodus, this graph up here, you'll see that red line is what is typically, very traditionally viewed as the path of the Exodus. And it has Mount Sinai all the way down here at the bottom of the peninsula. And that may be... I don't believe any longer that that is where Mount Sinai actually is. There's too many times where Mount Sinai is very close to Midian, you know, and where Mount Sinai is much closer to the Promised Land than it seems to be all the way down there. Some serious geographic scholars and looking at some evidence of, just think about Moses was able to go to Mount Sinai following herds, right? Very unlikely that living in Midian, which is on the right side there of the Gulf of Arabah there, that those goats would have gone all the way up and down and around the other side and all the way down that peninsula. So it ends up being much more likely, and most scholars now believe that Mount Sinai was probably up here in the wilderness Paran, or maybe even closer down to, and I tend to think probably down closer to Midian, right there on that border of Midian is the place of Mount Sinai. So of course we have no idea the path that they took to get there. We don't really know which mountain is Mount Sinai, but we do see some key events that happen here at Mount Sinai. The law is given, the covenant is made, the tabernacle is built. It's going to be this wandering tent. The prototype of the temple is built. And then, of course, after all those things, we still have the golden calf and that terrible party that happens here. The old law is given, and we don't have time for this, but just some things, difference between the old law and the new law, what it was going to take here. But that Exodus chapter 24, the giving of the law and the making of the covenant is one of the first mutual covenants, the first mutual covenant that we see between God and his people. Everything that has happened before, think about all of the people that have been in the Bible story throughout the book of Genesis. Did they have a whole lot of choice? Doesn't seem to be. God picked them and said, go do this. Now maybe Abraham could have not gone, right? But did Abraham have to agree to all these things? No, God just picked him. Okay, Adam, what choice did he have? Not much. But for the first time, God is going to make a contract, and it's going to put requirements on both God and on man. God is going to make certain promises. I will do this. But for the first time, what is he going to require? You have to hold up your part of the deal, okay? So both parties agree to this. We have this, the sacrifice and the blood is applied to the people. It's actually sprinkled on the leaders as representatives of the people, and it's sprinkled on the altar there in front of the tabernacle. Both parties agree to this, and we have for the first time this idea of conditional promises. Think about those promises to Abraham. God said, I will do this. There's one word missing from there that is in these promises. It's if. God didn't tell Abraham, you will get all of these things if you behave, if you do what I told you. God said it's going to happen unconditionally. However, these promises that we see here in the law are conditional. If you follow my word and if you keep your side of the contract, you're going to get all these good things. But if you don't, then you're going to get all these bad things. A conditional promise from God. Okay? So the covenant is made, the blood is applied. We have the idea of the tabernacle. You've all seen this kind of before, trying to get through some stuff here. So Moses, for the golden calf, he's up on the mountain. Aaron is left in charge. The people ask him to build a calf. Takes all their earrings and fashioned it with a graving tool. He made a golden calf. Later he claims, so I said to them, let anyone who has gold take it off. They gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf, like miraculously, whenever we know he's the one who made it there. So God becomes very angry, and he wants to kill them all and start over with Moses. And not for the last time, Moses, or the first time actually, Moses saves the people. He reminds God of the Egyptians. Hey, you just saved them all. You're going to make that go away. He reminds God of his promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And he basically argues for them. But then Moses doesn't just let that anger go away. When he comes down, he himself is very angry. He breaks the tablets, and he hands down some pretty serious punishments. They burn the idol and have the people drink it. Pretty bad. He sends some soldiers through the camp. 3,000 men who were leaders of this are killed. And then, of course, God sends a plague among them. So there's terrible punishment for this just falling away almost right away. So the people leave Sinai, and no matter where you think Sinai is, we are going to get up to a place called Kadesh Barnea. On the way, we're going to have the quail and the manna is going to start, the water from the rock, which is mentioned in the New Testament, lots and lots of murmuring over and over again. Aaron and Miriam rebel, and then there's another rebellion of Korah that takes place, and they take a census. Okay? Kadesh Barnea ends up being a very eventful place. The spies are sent to make their report. The 10 and 2 split, of course. So, of course, then people balk at taking the land. They complain against God and Moses again. Again, God wants to do what? All right, kill them all, okay? But Moses saves them again. So instead of killing them, God pronounces the wanderings. He is going to kill off everybody who is over 20 except the 2 spies and their family, okay? So people then decide, oh, well, we don't want to wander for 40 years. Let's go take the land. But of course, what happens? Immediately defeated and pushed back. Okay? So they are going to wander for 40 years, more quail and manna, more murmuring, Korah's revolt. Again, God wants to save them. Moses makes his big mistake with the water. He takes credit, so he then is going to be forbidden to enter the land, and that generation dies off. They then return to Kadesh Barnea after their wanderings are over, and we are ready to go on to the promised land. So they're going to cross over. They're not allowed to fight the Edomites, the Moabites, or the Ammonites because of their relationship to them. They do defeat 3 kings, Arad, Sihon, and Og. They're on the east side of the Jordan River, okay? And on the way, Aaron dies. We have the whole thing with Balaam and his donkey, the fiery serpents, which we're not going to talk about, but big thing in foreteller of Jesus. A second census is taken. The 3 tribes asked to stay on the east side and are allowed to, right? Gad, Reuben, and half of Manasseh. All right, sorry, we went a few minutes over. So that leaves us then on the plains of Moab. The whole book of Deuteronomy happens where Moses retells the law, and then Moses is going to die, and when we start on Wednesday, we are going to see Joshua take over. Thank you so much.